All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast. Have we got a very special episode for you today? We have a wonderful guest on the couch today talking about data and talking about how property is both art and science. We're going to dive deeply into the science today. What else, Ben?
Well, we're going to double click, Bryce, on dangers of single data measures. So our special guest is going to talk to us about the data that he gets to see and munge and play around with, and he's going to share some of those awesome insights. And Bryce, I'm not sure whether you're aware, but the RBA paused the cash rate. So we're going to also double click on our story around the property outlook that we did back in February and see where we currently sit right now. So big show, Bryce.
Big show, love it. We've got lots to cover. Let's rip into the show.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holdaway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council of Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance and money management.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast and welcome back to you too, Ben. Interest rate pause week. How are you?
Oh, don't you want to talk about the footy?
Did you see what I did there? Did you see what I did there?
Anyway, that's right. I'm happy not to talk about 3-0 and Freo's first win.
Here's what I'll talk to you about the footy about, mate. This is going to break. This is going to be make a lot of our listeners' ears bleed. It's going to break my spirit to admit it in public. But you're actually good to watch at the minute.
Yeah,
like you're actually good to watch at the minute, and that's not okay.
I have heard that through other sources. So no, their teams, they've got a winning belief. They've got untapped. Opportunity.
Now we're going to go through the thesis.
Here we go.
Interest rate pauses.
Yes, well, we're going to talk about that later. I don't want to talk about that too much yet. That's going to be my what's making property news. But we've also got an awesome guest. So let's rock.
Yeah, we're an awesome guest. But I want to talk to this, Ben, just before we get there.
Yep.
We received some feedback. We ask for people to rate us and review us. And our eternal hope is that people rate 5 stars and they say something effusive or positive about us. But someone has recently rated us and didn't give us 5 stars, but they gave us 2 and gave us some feedback. And I want to talk to this point because I think it's really important and just some feedback to our community that we do read them. We do take on board what you say. So this one is the name is Stegosaurus, Ben. So Stego, S-A-W-U-S. And this is under the heading Property Spruikers. These guys are very convincing, but be careful. I do wonder how many people they have encouraged into high debt and now are having trouble servicing those debts as their property portfolios concurrently fall in value. Yes, the majority of property investors will do fine, but I fear for people who are over-leveraged. Know these guys have a vested interest, which to their credit, they sometimes acknowledge. Okay, first of all, thank you for the feedback. We don't see that as anything other than an opportunity to make sure we stay true to our philosophy, stay true to who we are, right? So these guys are very convincing, but be careful. Okay, thank you. I think everyone should be careful, not just listening to us, but listening to everyone. So let's do a tick on that. I do wonder how many people they have encouraged into high debt and now having trouble servicing those debts. Hopefully, Ben, for our community, we have this nurturing, guiding North Star where we actually don't want our people to be leveraged into high debt and get themselves into trouble, which is why we've always talked to the fact that we want them to be planned. We want them to look around the corner. We want them to have a think about not just today, but sort of what's happening in the next couple of years. So trouble servicing those debts, it is our eternal hope that we have imparted knowledge into this community that they build buffers, and if they are clients of ours and they have a plan in place, we've done very conservative buffers, Ben. So I know you probably got something you want to say here, but I think these are important points. If this is what the sentiment that someone is feeling, we want to help people mitigate any of these concerns.
Probably a good reminder for the ABCD, Bryce, which is really CBAD, which is everything we do around frameworks is around cash flow, making sure you can afford it today and into the future. Borrowing power, making sure that you're okay and you can handle the borrowing power. Asset selection, and then mitigating risk through defence. And you would have heard us of many, many recent podcasts, and even from the start from 8 years ago, we've always talked about $2,000 a week, not being too greedy, not buying 15 or 20 or 30 of these types of things. So that will always be our message in terms of only take what you need to give yourself a comfortable retirement. Don't be too greedy. That also forms part of what we're talking about. But hey, to Stegosaurus, he's got to get a start and build course.
100%.
100%. So reach out to us, because we're thankful for the opportunity to remind people, and to your warning there in terms of, make us continue to hold us to account, make sure that we're putting all that information together. But that's pretty much all I've got to say about that one.
And Stegosaurus, if you feel like that's got a conflict of interest, if you don't want the course, that's fine. We're not trying to do anything other than say thanks for being transparent. I just want to talk to the last bit, Ben. No, these guys have a vested interest, which to their credit they sometimes acknowledge. Okay, let's be clear. We have a business. You and I, Ben, we have a business, and it is a done-for-you service. So if someone says, I don't want to do it myself, I want it done for them, we serve a place in the marketplace for that, and we've been very transparent around that. What we haven't done is gone and funded this podcast via ads, and we haven't funded it by having a constant interrupts about the Empower Wealth business. We haven't done that, and it's something that we are very proud of, right? So do we have a vested interest? Yes. We genuinely, anyone who gets to know us off air, know that we are super interested in helping people. Do we have a property portfolio ourselves? Yes. Do we have a business that pays us an income? Yes. Are we providing as much information and bringing our very best each and every week? I hope you feel the answer to that is yes, because we are trying our darndest to help the amount of people that send out a note to us to say, thanks for the info, we've implemented it, and now we're on track. And there is zero commercial relationship in that. That makes us just as proud, Ben. And we are stewards and shepherds to our clients to make sure that they are well looked after and going in the right direction. And we are unashamedly unapologetic about that, because there are people who want it done for them. So, but we don't want anyone over leveraged. We want to make sure your buffers are in place, and we agree you should be careful. Yeah. You should have a healthy dose of skepticism. If this is the first or second or maybe under 10 episodes that you've heard from us, listen to heaps more until you actually get a sense of who we are. Because until you do that, you probably shouldn't do anything with us.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, 50 years of combined in-field and active experience in the particular space. So we like to think that that's the information that we're sharing, and we like to think that the majority of our community feel that way. We are not turning into a media company. We are not going to spin off multiple, sub-interest opportunities for that. We are dedicated to financially transforming households, and the preferred method in which we help people do that is through direct residential property in terms of buying existing property. We don't buy new or off the plans as part of that particular story. So that's the message that we're sending. So thank you for those who gain value from that. We don't want anything in return, but if you need help on that journey with some trusted advisors who have walked that path in their business for coming up to almost 20 odd years, reach out to us.
Very good. So we're going to talk to that point in today's episode with our very special guest, Ben, about why we don't go brand new, why we go established. We're going to unpack that. It's super exciting. Before we get there, my Mindset Minute theme today is very much around the fact that former President Trump, Ben, was indicted, flew his flew his private jet from Florida to New York to face the music in the New York legal system. But it just I was playing around and I've got two quotes from two former presidents here, right? So the first one is Franklin D. Roosevelt, the former president of the United States back in 1933 to 1945. Not only former president, but also a real estate investor. This is what Franklin Roosevelt had to say about real estate. Real estate cannot be lost or stolen, nor can it be carried away. purchased with common sense, paid for in full, and managed with reasonable care, it is about the safest investment in the world. All right. So then, some 84 years after that president was in office, Ben, we had Donald Trump. So is also a real estate person. But this is what Donald Trump had to say. Real estate is at the core of almost every business, and it's certainly at the core of most people's wealth. In order to build your wealth and improve your business smarts, you need to know about real estate. So I just thought it'd be a little cheeky play on the fact that the former president is in office, but 84 years apart, but similar views, Ben. So the view on the real estate class has stood the test of time. Not only was it popular back in 1933 when Franklin Roosevelt was the president, but it's still popular today. So
probably the most trustworthy sentence that Donald Trump's ever said, Bryce.
It wasn't lost on me that we shouldn't be taking too much
advice from Donald Trump.
from former President Trump. But anyway, there you go, folks. All right, let's get into today's show, Ben. We have a very special guest. You and I are super excited to chat with Kent today. He's got some insights into property and data and comes from a very, very rich history. So let's cut to the conversation you and I recently had with Kent Lardner. All right, man, we've got a very special guest today. We are, of course, chatting with Kent Lardner, first time on the Property Couch. Kent is one of Australia's best and most respected property data analysts with over 30 years experience with a focus on property data and analytics that started in 1999 working in lenders mortgage insurance with GE. Whilst heading up the valuation services team, he studied statistics and trained with industry experts in the US and in Canada. These skills helped him design the Price Finder platform, where Kent was one of the original company founders. With the sale of Price Finder to the Domain Group, Kent took a lead role at CoreLogic, heading up the analytics team and products for the banking sector. This included the design and rollout of various risk products for valuers and banks. That CoreLogic opportunity extended to China, where he developed an automated valuation model for the largest bank in the world, ICBC. His focus today is suburb trends and is also regularly quoted by media outlets such as the Australian Financial Review, news.com.au, realestate.com.au, and now the propertycouch.com.au. Welcome to the Property Couch, Kent.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for the invite.
Oh, it's been ages, mate. We've been waiting a long time to get you on. So yes, it's been great.
I think we spoke about this it was almost a year ago, I think.
It could have been, mate, but it could have been. But so thrilled to have you on. It's really exciting to get you on the couch.
And we've got a lot more to talk about.
There is heaps to talk about. Our listeners are going to get an insight into why we've been excited to chat with you, Kent, because it's fair to say your understanding of the Australian property market is exceptional. So our audience is in for a real treat. But we're going to start this conversation where we always start the conversation with our guests, Kent, and we want to turn back time. We want you to go back to when you were growing up, having conversations over the dinner table. What were the conversations that you were having around money?
Well, we didn't have any. So we were, it was just my mother and I in the western suburbs of Sydney in Housing Commission. I say to people, I looked up to those with a CIFA index score of 1 for anyone, and that's kind of a bit of a data nerd joke. But we had no money. So it was all the planning was around how do we climb out of this hole and how can I get to work as quickly as I can? That was the extent of it. So did not grow up with money and did not grow up with too many financial skills at all. So that was just, whatever I could glean from the Michael J. Fox character. So I think you remember that show?
Yes.
Family Ties. Alex, whatever his name was, Alex B. Keaton.
Alex B. Keaton.
That was about it for a role model. Yeah.
We just lost all our millennials, but you took me down a trip down memory lane there, particularly as we go into the Back to the Future franchise as well. But tell us a bit more about what did that actually mean, Kent? So you didn't have any money, and you had that joke around a CIFA index, but that's obviously a well-being index for suburbs, and 1 is tongue in cheek, not the aspiration. But So can we unpack that a little bit more? What were the conversations like, and what were the conditions like for you?
Yeah, it was quite a challenge because we didn't have a car. So if I were to go to any event, sports or whatever, it was a dependency on friends or family or, teammates or the coach to come and collect me. So it was always a bit of a challenge. But having said that, humour was a big part of it. And I think we had a dry humour at home and a dry humour in the suburb, and that would kind of summed up growing up in the 1970s. So it was rough and tumble and fun. So, if you're poor and your monk's poor, you don't really realise the points of difference. The only thing for us is we were one of the few families without a car. I would say that would be the only thing I felt. Other than that, I felt rather normal.
And Kent, in terms of when you started earning money at 13, in terms of, was there any money system that you and your mum had implemented? Did you have a jar system? How did you organise finances and banking generally?
No, nothing, no skill at all. So it was not much to discuss. It was quite literally living week to week through to my teen years. So it was really little discussion about savings. It was more money was a tool to buy the next thing. So when you're on those lower social rungs, money's just a means to buy something, not invest. So the investment discussion never came into play at all.
Yeah. So you said it changed when you were a teenager. Where was the pivot point where there was an awareness around sort of week to week, hand to mouth, and then you saw a different side? And what shifted in you at that time?
Yeah, I started to save. So, I started working really early. I had a little bit of a fib about my age and started working part-time. So I could save. So I started to buy the things I wanted, like tools to do things around the house and be the man of the house. But then I started to squirrel away extra money so I could buy a car. So I bought myself a car. I was one of the first kids to buy a car independently, etc. So I think for me it was a case of, wow, this routine works. I had a deposit for a house at the age of 19. So it was just, head down, backside up, and squirreling away the money. But again, it was never a focus on investment or an understanding or an appreciation what investing meant at all.
When did you discover the whole idea? So, putting money away and then saving up to realise a short-term goal, i.e. buy a car. Was there a transformation or any mentor, books or anything that then sort of took you onto the direction to sort of say, hang about, rather than just saving money, I can actually invest money and I get a return on investment, and sort of how did you then connect that into the property investment space and the journey you went on there?
Yeah, I guess I don't think there was that transition to understanding or appreciating investing. Really, that came probably more in my 20s where I started to. I always had an obsession with property. That started at a very early age, and I think that was mainly born of the fact that you never owning a house and never having a family member. Your grandmother was in public housing. So you had this social network of people who kind of didn't own houses. So it became a dream, a goal in life to get my own house. And then the next stream after acquiring a house was get it paid off as quickly as possible. So for me, housing represented a very different thing to somebody who would look at housing in an investment from an investor's perspective. My view was different. And even today, when we talk about property data and analytics, I'm fascinated with the data, less the property, if that makes sense. Property data is my thing. Property is other people, for other people. So, people who are obsessing and love property, that's great. I love property data. So that adding that extra word really does, paint a much clearer picture of me.
Yeah, and I think you've hinted or pretty much answered this question, but I noted down you said you saved for a deposit for a house at 19, and you mentioned your mother didn't have a house, and then you just also mentioned your grandmother didn't have a house. So there would have been some track in your mind that we don't buy houses, and then all of a sudden you buy something at 19. But it sounds like the experience of that family tree is what was the fuel, right, for you to make sure that you were someone who changed the pathway versus staying on the track that was laid before you.
Yeah, and I think, I spent a lot of time living with my grandmother, and she instilled in me a lot of these values. So she didn't want me to ever be in debt. It was some of her values. So and it was even the history goes way back, where there was a family tragedy. My grandmother's father, he died in an accident with multiple deaths, effectively driving a truck. A lot of people on the truck hit by a train, and it caused a lot of grief for many decades because the family was sued. So family thrust into poverty as a result of an incident, a tragedy. And it was kind of almost like a reckoning, or a way to kind of effectively put that behind us as a family.
Now, Kent, in terms of, my final question in this space is, how much of that thinking has influenced how now with you and your beautiful family, how do you now then look at money? Do you feel like you're now in control of it, or you still worry about money, given the legacy piece that you've had there as well?
No, a pivot point for me was the sale of the Price Finder business. So at that time, I had a very small mortgage, investment property, and owner-occupied property. The sale of the Price Finder business, I was a very small shareholder, but it was enough to actually change my life, in that I no longer had to really worry about the next mortgage payment. So within an hour of that coming in, my whole dream was wipe out all debt. So, within an hour, the payment came in from the sale of that, and we wiped out our debts, and I slept really, really well from that day on. So in terms of, I wouldn't really know. Every 3 or 4 months, I go to my wife and say, what have we got in the account? So it's like, it's not my number one thing. It's just more, I don't want it to govern my life. I just want it to be something in the background, so I can just get on with being creative and doing my thing during the day without thinking about money, if that makes sense.
And while I'm being debt-free.
And it's not about fancy cars.
Yeah.
That's it.
Debt-free,
trouble-free.
About. Yep.
That's it. That was the big driver. Her dream was that I would never ever owe money to anybody. She was my number one influence in life. So for all rights or wrong, I think you're saying don't have any debt. I would have loved to have a lot of debt and invested heavily in property 20 years ago. I did it lightweight because I was petrified of debt.
Yeah.
Wow. So, and you just gave a little breadcrumb insight into what is arguably the greatest status symbol that we should all aspire to, and is that's owning our own home and having it paid off, more so than all of the other bling things that come with it. But interesting. You talked about the aversion to debt, because we will lean on that in terms of your own. Because you do have a competitive advantage with the understanding that you do have around property data, which we'll touch on shortly. But before we do there, I'm interested. We are now. This is going out on Thursday, the 6th of April. So the Reserve Bank met earlier this week and made the first pause for some time in this tightening cycle. What does that like? And then all of the overflowing commentary that comes from that. What does that mean? Is it happening next month? All that sort of stuff, right? But what does it mean for you as a property scientist? How does that play into your analysis of the spreadsheets and everything that you're doing at the level that you see the property market?
Well, the problem with interest rates for a long time was that they weren't variable. There was not much, data variables are meant to be variables, and your interest rates, when they were low and flat for so long, weren't having much play in any models. So, when they weren't varying, you ignored them from a data perspective. Suddenly, when they started to rise, they came into play, and things that you ignored or took for granted in terms of, say, borrowing capacity, which is the biggest driver of the market right now, is suddenly now it makes sense. And that's probably the biggest thing I've learned, is that there are data variables that you do take for granted if they lay flat for a long period of time. And then suddenly they wake up and everything changes and dynamics change and their interaction with other variables change. And your appreciation of that variable instantly changes, else you fail. So I think for interest rates, to answer your question right now, is I think this is going to waken up a few people who've been sitting on the sidelines waiting for this this moment where they were tentative, didn't want to enter. And there's some of the fundamentals right now are very, very strong. We've got such an undersupply in the market, in the housing market. There's a lot of houses, there's a lot of housing markets that have dipped and been dipping for 12 months or more, have come down considerably, yet their fundamentals are strong, really strong. And we are not climbing out of this undersupply situation anytime soon.
So with that point, Kent, we did see CoreLogic's numbers surprise on the upside around some, national price growth, 0.6, I think it was from memory. Sydney, 1.4%. So are you talking to that story because the level of supply is so low and there is enough sustained demand there where people are seeing value and now we're starting to see price growth in some markets around Australia?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people, treat everybody as a first home buyer when they're thinking of buyers. But, you think about it, a third of people own their property outright. And if you look at the ABS data, they do give you a breakdown segmentation of sizes of mortgages, which kind of tells you the distribution of wealth or assets in a suburb. And it's very, I think a lot of people would be surprised to see how significant, how large the proportion of small mortgages are in many suburbs, especially a lot of the blue chip suburbs where, 30, 40% fully owned, and then a very, very large proportion of small mortgages. So yes, you have people who aspire to entering an expensive suburb and go, mortgage themselves to the hilt to get in. They're a vulnerable cohort, but they're not a massive cohort. The biggest cohort in a lot of these blue chip suburbs are people who own outright and or have a small mortgage. So I think when you look at some of these, broadly, let me call them blue chip suburbs, some of these blue chip suburbs have served up some pretty good buying, and the tide's turned. The tide has turned already as per the CoreLogic data.
And just to build on that story of the data that you're looking at, it's obviously the greenfield areas where the bulk of housing stock is new and the bulk of people buying those are buying those with mortgages. And so that's potentially when you're also seeing some of that stress around housing affordability and servicing debt on those particular properties. Is that what you're seeing in the data, Kent?
Exactly. I spent several years in mortgage insurance, LMI, and it was originally called GE Mortgage Insurance, before that Housing Loans Insurance Corporation, then GE, and then it became Genworth. Too many name changes, I can't keep up. And we would look at the claims, and it would really have a significant impact because I'd go out in the field and look at these properties, and often you'd find the areas that were 10 kilometres outside of a small regional area. And, the 10-10 rule, as I call it, so a population centre less than 10 and 10K out were the high-risk areas, especially when they were greenfield builds. But typically you will find that the level of the percentage of fully owned is negligible. They're new estates. And then of that, most people are first-home buyers, so the ABS data will tell you that, these people are heavily mortgaged. So you don't have any of those things that you see in those blue chip suburbs. And you don't have that for a couple of decades.
Folks, I haven't said this for a little while, but I reckon you should just rewind for the last couple of minutes because there was a masterclass of points there, because the mortgage diversity within a suburb is a really, really important point. And quite often someone will say to us, hey, listen, why do you guys always say buy established? Because I bought something in an estate and the land value went up and I've made some money and there was some incentives, and it's like, okay, no problem. In a certain part of the cycle or in a certain part of the stimulus package that you receive, there's opportunity. But I think that mortgage diversity that you talked about, some have got no debt, some have got a little bit of debt, some have got a lot of debt, is a really, really important point when it comes to property investing, because that's what you're actually relying on to take away the volatility, and that's what you're actually relying on for it to stay, to your words, the blue chip suburb over a long period of time. Because there is a whole, say someone comes in and they've hocked themselves to the eyeballs and they actually can't afford to stay in the suburb. Well, that's fine, because most of the other people in the suburb are fine, and you'll fall out of the suburb and two people are willing to take your place. And it kind of gives that underlying security within the suburb versus the point that you two just talked to about those estates. So I think I'd really love everyone who's listening to this to really double down on that, because it's such a crucial point.
Well, an interesting case study. A friend phoned me literally yesterday. He lives in Manly Vale in Sydney, and he wants to upgrade his house, wants a bigger house. He's in a prime street, prime location, just needs a bigger house. And he was thinking, the mortgage cliff's coming. I think I'll sell, I think I'll rent, and then I'll upgrade. And we did the numbers and we worked back. And I said, well, let's look at how many properties have sold in the last few years that fit that cohort of at risk. And then we worked it out. We backtracked and we said, well, even if everyone fell off that cliff, all 13 of them fell off that cliff, there's not a lot of properties, and there's going to be two, to your point, right? There's going to be two for every one sold, there's going to be two lined up to buy. So it was a really easy back of the envelope measure to say, stay put, don't sell, don't gamble on this fictional mortgage cliff that's going to convert your blue chip suburb to something else, and it's going to stay blue chip.
And that's why we refer to it as the systemic risk story. And it's got to be played. We always want to mitigate that type of risks. So, Ken, I want to move on to a lot of people sitting on their hands, both on the buying side, and we've definitely seen that in our data. But there's also a lot of people who have also held off listing their property. So now that we've got this pause, what's next? What do you see potentially happening? Because it's really going to test the depth of the demand side. And if no new stock comes on, there's going to be some really interesting, data reads over the next 3 to 6 months.
There's the where do I buy? What can I buy argument. And I don't want to sell if I can't find something to buy. So I'll sit tight.
Yeah.
And then you've got the other factor, which is the crossover between the rental market and the seller's market, because there's nowhere for me to rent in between. So we've got very tight rental markets creating some fascinating things in the capital market, in the sale market. And I think, obviously investors don't chase the low yield suburbs, but certainly people still want to find properties to rent in those areas. So I think that's going to have a big bearing. But, I analyse a lot of off-market. So I look at how many properties in a certain suburb have been owned for 10 years or more. I net out the rentals, and these are the ones with a higher propensity to list. And it's fascinating to see how big that is in some suburbs. It's a very dominant cohort in many, many suburbs, and others it's a really small one. So it's a great way to identify what's going to happen in the next 12 months, because if there's very, very few properties that have been owned for 10 years or more, there's not a lot of people likely to sell.
Very true.
So we want to pivot to getting your experience around analysing property data, and I guess the dangers of single data measures. So you've got a view on that. What's the biggest danger people face when they look at stuff in isolation?
I think the biggest, pick on the first one, it's the obvious one, the suburb median. And a lot of people just look at the suburb median on its own. They don't look at it through time. So the first thing you'd probably want to look at is the price distribution. We spoke earlier about the distribution of mortgages, or the size of mortgages at a suburb level. Same thing. The distribution of prices or price segments tells us a lot about the median, tells us a lot about that suburb. A beachside suburb is going to be bimodal or trimodal. There's going to be 3 or 4 markets in a beachside suburb. So it tells you a little bit about whether the median's a robust measure or not. The other thing I want to do is also look at how's that changing through time. And the last thing you want to do is rely on just a 12-month change, because what you might find is things are dipping in the last few months. So if I only look at, say, how has the suburb median changed in the last 12 months? Great, it's grown by 13% or 14%. But what it didn't tell you is it's dropped by 3 or 4% in the last couple of months. So you want to look at it as a continuous trend line through time. But you never really want to look at just the suburb, because the suburb is going to likely be volatile. Volatile because it may have a very odd distribution of prices. It could also be volatile because very few properties are selling. And that was our point earlier on. There are so many suburbs with very, very low levels of inventory, low levels of listing, low turnover. So I like to zoom out and look at the median at the SA3 level, a statistical area 3, kind of like the old local government areas, but a cluster of suburbs. So you get a lot more reliable metrics. So don't just look at the suburb median on its own. Don't just look at the suburb median and what it was 12 months ago. There are so many dimensions on a median price alone that you can really get an insight into a market from.
Can you help the listeners really land that plane right? So you talk at SA3 level, but you've got SA1, 2, 3, and 4, right? So SA1 is concentrated within a suburb. SA2 is a couple of suburbs. SA3 is. Can you just really land that plane for everyone?
Yeah. So an SA1 is the smallest area, give or take, a couple of hundred homes, that the Australian Bureau of Statistics, I'll just say ABS for now, it's the smallest area that they'll divulge that census information without worrying about privacy. So effectively, the SA1 then is like a Lego block that goes into an SA2. An SA2 is 2 to 3 suburbs big, just depends on where you are. If you're in a really dense area, densely populated inner city, some SA2s are just one suburb large. But as you move into some of the regions, etc., you might go 4 or 5 suburbs large. But on average, 2 to 3 is pretty reasonable. The thing about an SA2, what's good about an SA2 is the naming convention. Usually they name it after the largest suburb in that cohort. I'm using the word cohort a lot, but that's okay. You'll forgive me. So effectively, Lambton, New Lambton, or whatnot. So it's usually the largest, most populated suburb goes first. So it becomes a little bit easier to understand. And more often, I often call an SA2 a suburb in the media just to be friendly. Because SA1s don't have any names, they got numbers, so you can't really use those. SA3s, there's a few hundred of those around the country. I typically analyse about 330 of them ongoing. Some of them align quite neatly to the old local government area, LGA. But what happened is Brisbane, for example, became the blob. And it grew and it grew, and suddenly council amalgamations made it a huge city-size LGA. So reporting on Brisbane using the LGA is reporting on the whole city. But there's so many sub-markets in Brisbane. The east is different to the inner west. And so carving up Brisbane using the SA3s was the catalyst for me to drop LGAs altogether and just go to the SA3. And the beautiful thing about the ABS and what it does in terms of carving up these areas, it's designed specifically for statistical purposes. So if they've got to kind of draw a line and say, does that suburb go best there or there, they'll align it to where it best fits statistically. So, they'll try and kind of smooth things out by tipping a suburb where it best belongs with other similar people, similar price properties, etc. And it works a treat, whereas I kind of look at it, an LGA is designed for collecting garbages and a postcode's designed for delivering postcards. So, the ABS stuff really works when it comes to property.
Now, Kent, there's a really big story in here, right? Because for those people who are following property at home or are novices or don't have this as their full-time gig, are you telling them that median house prices are unreliable to determine values of particular areas, because I know that you and I have had great conversations about this because of exactly that point, that variability when it comes to different suburbs. And again, I mean, you can drive through different parts of a suburb and you can have a row of terrace houses, which are 6 metres wide. And then you have all of these other sort of Federation homes, Victorian homes, where they're 12 or 15 metres wide. But guess what, everyone? They're 3-bedroom houses. And the median house price of that 3-bedroom house is X. Now, so I know I'm really basically putting a pin in the balloon of everyone who looks at medians and looks at performances against medians and are going, oh, that's not really great. And this is the challenge of analysing property at all levels. We've got, Kent in regards to SA3 levels, other people reporting on medians, inconsistency of median values across different data collectors. I mean, it's just hard. And that's why I've always said that anyone who thinks that you can just do everything from a data point of view without actually getting in the suburb or doing flyovers using Google Earth and looking at the different natures of the land sizes, the topography, and all of those other things are effectively doing themselves an injustice. And that is the big danger for me in terms of what you're saying about singling out of those particular data points as, okay, well, the median's dropped by 15%. So that means that every house in that suburb is automatically worth 15% less. If you take that approach, you are wrong. You are blatantly wrong. And
Yes.
if you take an approach on long-term performance and so forth, you are wrong. Now, we have to, when we are providing advice and when we're doing this type of work, we have to put some measure in there, right? So we most people, the preferred form of measure is median value for houses or for units. We don't even have it at townhouses or, and units. What is that? Is that an apartment, a unit, a villa? I mean, so what you've got to do is use that as a gauge and a guide only, and then you've got to start doing the legwork. You've got to start basically double clicking on all of those data points and then start to form an opinion. And that's very hard across, as you say, 15,000, 16,000 odd suburbs.
True. And there's all sorts of scenarios where you've got, say, new stock being released. So pick on apartments for a moment. If you've got a new apartment block being released in that suburb, what impact does that have on apartment price medians? They surge, they go up. But actually, the market risk can go up because you've got all this excess supply. It's just that the median goes up because of the composition. I like to kind of look at a suburb median as just a descriptive stat. It's just a description of what that data is, the midpoint of all the values lined up high to low at a point in time. And you come back a week later and that could be different again. So a couple of call outs is, what are you measuring in terms of your sample size? We know a suburb is a suburb. Okay, that's okay. But are you looking at 12-month rolling sample size, or are you looking at a 3-month or a 6-month? And that's probably the biggie. That's probably the number one reason. The other call out really is the areas that are volatile through time are going to be the ones that are more prone to having variances between providers, because that volatility through time is because I didn't include that one and now I did, and that bounces around. So it could just be that not everyone's captured that one particular property or those two extra properties. So often the giveaway will be, is there volatility in that line at that suburb level through that one provider or any of the data providers? Is it volatile through time? That is a good lead indicator to tell you it's going to be prone to significant variances between the providers. And you've heard of the Hedonic index. Now, I'm not here to talk about any particular brand, but Hedonic index attempts to try and account for the variances in it and smooth things out and make it well behaved. And Ben, to your example earlier on, if you had 3 houses that sold that were a very small lot size, and then you had a big house that was a 15 metre frontage, what it would do, one approach, a hedonic approach, would be to try and treat them all as the same size. Make all of those adjustments so they're treated like exactly the same size property. So they're all a 400 square metre property, 3-bedroom, blah, blah, blah. So there are some techniques that you can attempt to overcome them if you attempt to measure the median, but there's different ways to measure house prices. And I would argue that one of the better ways to do it is pull up a group of properties that you're fairly comfortable with that represent the norm for the suburb, and then just do a retrospective appraisal of them as of a year ago. Group them together, and that's their price today, and go back and pull up those properties and do a retrospective comparative market analysis or desktop appraisal as of a year ago. And by the time you get to the third or the fourth one, you've got a pretty comfortable view of how that price has changed.
Yeah, because it kind of talks to the point that you're actually buying at the property level. You're not buying at the suburb, which most of these metrics are given. And then what you're saying is, well, particularly in an environment that we're in now, a lot of the A properties aren't actually moving, right? It's the C properties and maybe the B minus. So you're actually then the methodology that you just adopted then is beautiful, right? Because it's saying, well, you're not buying the suburb. You're not actually buying a state. You're not buying Australia. You're buying a property in a street. And so why don't you just have a look at another property in another street and 2 or 3 or 4 more times, and then so you can actually form a pattern about the property that you're buying. And, we're finding that ourselves, Kent, with our buying team, right? Because we're talking to a client and they're saying, hang on a second, the headlines are saying everything's tanking. And we're going, well, let us tell you what's actually happening. We had to go at that one and we missed it. We had to go at that one. There was 3 offers and we had to go at that one. And it took us, half an hour longer to get through the opens than the other. So because the type of properties that we target do not represent a headline. They do not represent. There's no general commentary that can represent what we're targeting. And I think again, what you just described is a very pragmatic and sensible approach. But when most people are exposed to just generalized commentary, well, then it's easy for them to fall into the hysteria that comes with it, right?
Yeah, well, the air quotes of the property market. Well, I'd probably argue that there's 300 plus housing markets and about 150 unit markets across the country. Each one being a statistically significant SA3.
Good point, Kent. So look, now we've talked about the dangers of the single data measurements. You've gone through those. What are some of the takeaways? What are the 3 sort of big things that can allow you to sort of get more confident about the data that you're looking at?
Yeah, I always like to look at the distributions as my starting point. So I'd look at the price segmentation. So you get a lay of the land, understand the suburb. Are there sub-markets or markets within the suburb? And the classic example is, beach down one end, and it's a long, narrow suburb that ends up 2 or 3 kilometres away from the beach. They're the perfect scenarios where you've got 2 or 3 sub-markets. So look at the price distribution as your first port of call. Look at the suburb median, great, but look at it in context of the overall area, the SA3, because I liken that to the tide. Very hard for a suburb to swim against the tide. If the SA3 market's moving in a certain direction, odds are that your suburb is lagging or leading slightly, but it will regress back to that SA3 median given time. So that would be my big focus if you're looking at prices. Prices are tough. So I always like to look at it and extend it to another dimension called inventory. That's a go-to for me. The Yanks love it. So it really just looks at how many properties are listed for sale, how many are selling. So it's a ratio of those 2 expressed as months. So for example, if I've got 10 listings, 5 selling per month, 10 divided by 5, 2 months of stock. If that inventory level is building, then there's downward pressure on price. Yeah, obviously. So if that inventory level is decreasing, then the market's starting to repair. And there's a lot of markets right now where people are not selling, they're not listing, they've decided not to sell because they don't like the conditions, etc. And we are faced with a very, very low pipeline supply. So when you factor in that there's not a lot of people listing, there's not a lot of listings out there, we've got very low inventory levels. That's why I keep on dismissing many of the headlines, because if there's no properties listed for sale, then the odds of a price crash are pretty low. So that's what it's come down to. There's not an excess. There's no excess inventory. There will be pockets and are pockets where there's a lot of listings, and they're the ones at risk. But by and large, most suburbs across Australia do not have high inventory levels.
And in closing out this section of our catch-up, when we talk about look at the time since peak, what was the peak, and looking at affordability, what are you looking for in those particular data points?
Yeah, I love affordability. There's two measures of affordability that I'm obsessing about right now. The first one is sale price affordability. So I look at it as how many years of household income would it take to cover the median price? So, a line in the sand for me is 10 years. So if you're buying in an area that requires 10 years or less of household income, annualized household income to cover that median price, I would generally consider that an affordable area. So it's just a comparative measure. And as you start to get less and less affordable, I think you have a little bit of risk there, because people are going to have to mortgage themselves a lot to enter in. A great example of this is a lot of people exited Melbourne and exited Sydney into these outskirt areas. They weren't commutable distances. They were Richmond Tweed. They were, down around the coastlines, south of Geelong. The areas well, right? These areas,
very well,
south coast of New South Wales. So they were not commutable, but they were beautiful lifestyle locations. And a lot of people exited with pocketfuls of Sydney money or pocketfuls of Melbourne money in COVID. And what we found is those areas right now have seen a bit of a surge in inventory in comparison. And what I put that down to is affordability became such that these markets became dependent upon cashed up buyers from Sydney and Melbourne. And what they've done, these regional markets, they've totally disconnected themselves from the locals. And the measure of, the only measure I've got to tell me that is the likely root cause is the affordability measure. Because what we're doing is we're measuring the local average salary or household income, and we're comparing that to house prices. And when those two disconnect, you see what we're seeing right now in a lot of these markets where, suddenly now you've turned your back on local buyers. Where do they go? They can't buy in Byron Bay. Tell me, how many first home buyers do you know in Byron Bay right now?
Yeah, not many.
Chris Hemsworth's son will be.
Yeah, there you go. So that was the first one. And then the other measure of affordability is rentals. And I'm really obsessing about this one. This one's a bit easier to measure because we effectively have got weekly rentals and weekly household income. And this one, we've got a percentage. So we typically draw the line and say, am I spending more than 30% of household income on rents? And as I start to get above that 30% mark, I start to worry that rent rises are not sustainable. So people who are investing in areas just looking at a single dimension of data, i.e. rental yield, are really putting themselves at risk if they're not stepping back and looking at a few other data points, such as affordability. Why? Because if you've got a high yield area that you're relying on a high rent, is that rent going to stay high if the affordability ratio is up around 40%? I'm going to argue no. There's every chance that rent could come back down again because all the forces are going to be against you.
And Kent, you see that? I mean, can I double click on this? Sorry, Bryce, I know I'm hogging here a bit, but there is some really interesting stories there around. We've often talked about being a price taker as an investor and going into markets for the long term where owner-occupier appeal, owner-occupied measures are sitting at that 70% of the market, and we should always be price takers. What Kent is highlighting there in that data and the cycle of the data in the short term is that we can be attracted as investors to run after really high yielding areas. And what is actually spiking property prices is a movement of investors into that market, whether it be through latest research reports or a buyer's agency group
Top tens.
or whatever it might be pushing into those locations, then we are artificially manufacturing price movements in those particular locations. The then test is, how does that land? Like ultimately what goes up, we'll see who's been swimming naked in those particular locations, because when those yields start to deteriorate and the investors are sitting in there saying, well, where's my capital growth over the last decade? They got a spike because effectively there was enough of that investor demand coming into that location. So when you get groups of investors, whether they be on Reddit sites or any type of one of those community sites, and everyone's plugging this location and that location, and if everyone follows, well, yeah, I mean, like, it's very easy to buy a $400,000 property if you're a doctor or a surgeon and you've got a buyer's agency business or a property advisor, and everyone's going into that location thinking, wow, this was amazing. You guys did great. I got a 22% price growth. I got good rental, and then the next 8 or 9 years it does nothing, and it actually gives back some of that gain. So that's those. So I really love those metrics that you were just using about what about the locals? What about the people in that particular market in terms of their income story? And, how is that sustainable when we've had this artificial, sort of demand coming into that story, moving markets? Which leads me to one question, and I'm sure you want to make a comment to that, Kent, but the question I've got there is, in terms of what do you use for your income? Do you use the census, and then are you just running a wage index on top of that to increase that? Because obviously every census is every 5 years.
Yes. So we can be a little bit lazy with the census data for the time being, but as it's in the next couple of years we will have to index it. But what you'll find now, I've been plugging in some of the, if you use your prompts, I don't know if everyone's probably heard and talking about CHAT GBT now. You plug in your requirements and you get a model built for you within seconds that does all the heavy lifting for you in CHAT GPT to index these things. It's just mind-blowing. So I went to CHAT GPT yesterday and said, look, if I had a mortgage of this at this interest rate back in, and these are the subsequent interest rate movements based on salaries, but telling it all the input variables, it spat out a model for me. And it indexed up mortgage, like current mortgage level, and it indexed wages. So you can do all of it really, really effectively now using CHAT GPT. So you can take your ABS data, plug it all in. As long as you articulate what you want from it, it will do the job for you.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it's
prompt engineering.
That's where we're mind-blowing.
It is definitely mind-blowing. So, Ken, can you talk to those points that you just raised around affordability? Is Tassie sort of a little petri dish or microscope of that? Because you had a bunch of people bringing money from the mainland, driving lots of cash into that market, and then all of a sudden you've now got this scenario, to your point and to Ben's point, where the locals have got to be able to afford it based on the local incomes that they're receiving. And one of our team has a 30-year career in the Tasmanian market, and her feedback was, sure, that's all right, it's going up now, but it's what happens afterwards. So it means that those people who got some short-term gains, if they were able to leverage it, great. But if they're playing a long game, is that a good point to your 2 points around affordability, that market?
It is. It's a similar scenario to the Byron Bay or the south coast of New South Wales, etc., or the surf coast. You've had a flood of people from Melbourne going to Tassie, but it's kind of, there's a common theme. They're picturesque, beautiful areas. I can go and buy a property with a view. This looks fantastic. Off I go. I've got plenty of surplus because I've sold for $2.5 million, and I can go and buy a property with water views for 1.5. And that's what happened. But effectively, I think what they've done is detach these markets from the locals. And the metric that I'm being using is affordability, and that applies in both rental and sale affordability. But yeah, Hobart has a lot of pockets of high inventory right now. So inventory is building up, which is telling me,
right now, heaps.
and it's following the same path as Richmond, Tweed, Coastal, etc.
So, Kent, is there any sort of rules of thumb? We've talked about affordability as a rule of thumb of income and how much it would take over 10 years to buy the property and be mortgage free is sort of one of your, quasi metrics. In terms of rental yields, is there any sort of percentage ratios or variables or indicators that you use as a good rule of thumb?
I used to kind of use 3.5% higher, and then I nudged it higher, and then I kept on nudging it higher and higher and higher. So now, for example, I used to create a map, or I still do. I kind of do it when I feel like it, and I call it the cash flow clusters map. And what I was doing was taking individual properties, taking their asking price or sale price, so actually taking their sale price, and then pairing it to a rental estimate. And not doing it at a median, because the median really relies on the house you're buying to be a middle value property, whereas a lot of the high yielding stuff are not at the middle, they're at the lower. So I was plotting this on a map, and I was using a cutoff about 3 years ago when I first started doing it of about 3.5%, because I needed that much to get a decent map out of it, right, to try and plot a 1,000 odd properties every month. And then I bumped it up to 4.5. Now I've bumped it up to about 5.5. So the volume of properties now that you're getting higher yields is significant. My point, though, is you'd probably want to lower your sights on the yield so you can focus more on the other variables and pick better locations. So, should I chase yield alone, or should I trade off the yield and let the Reddit users and the forum users chase the 7s? I'll chase the 5s, but I'll go for the better quality capital gain areas, etc. Does that? Did I answer your question, or did I go on a?
No, that's all right. You've got, just for clarity for our community, you're talking about gross rental yield percentages there. Is that what, or is that a margin on top?
Yes, that's all. Yeah, I just use on the gross, and I just kind of the question comes up every now and then. What do you make an adjustment? And it's just a crude percentage adjustment to get it back to net. But I mainly just work on advertised rentals and gross.
And so coming back to the original question, then there was a question around that sort of: are you looking at any rental affordability measures and any metrics that may trigger that? If prices keep going up, there may not be a rental demand in that particular market because people just can't afford it?
Yeah, I'm tracking anything above 30% as unaffordable, but there's a lot of areas right now that are getting above 40% of household income at that suburb level or the SA2 level being allocated to rent. So there's a lot of areas right now that are showing up these extremely high yields. But if you just take, a slight different dimension, a look at, say, affordability, you're looking at 40% plus of household income being allocated rent. Then you look at the socioeconomic scores, and a lot of these areas are 1 or 2, which means that they're low income levels. So when you weigh it up, if you just put the blinkers on and went and zeroed in on yield, you are taking a lot of risk because there's a lot of market pressure on that rent not staying high.
Good insights there, wonderful insights. I guess for a takeaway for our audience, we for the entirety of this podcast, Ben and I have been doing for the last 8 years, have been about long-term game. So we're trying to get all of our listeners and our clients and the people who believe in what we believe in to think in terms of decades, not years, right? So I know from conversations with you previously and commentary you've made in the past that you kind of have an evergreen metric system that you apply to suburbs so that people can get a bit of a sense for the long game. Can you just riff that off and share with our listeners so that they can, because that would fully play into the philosophy of this podcast, that it's a longer game.
Yeah, it was born of a criticism. I had a lady call me up, a referral to say, help me buy. I want to look for a few investment locations. And it stretched over a few months. And what I did is I gave her a list of suburbs, and then the list entirely changed next month because the scorecard I was using threw in all of those, those foundation, variables and market variables. So suddenly suburbs that went from having 5 listings or higher didn't show up because their listings might have fallen down to 3, and I had that as a cutoff variable, etc. So the reason why I woke up to this error of my ways was this lady was critical, and I copped it on the chin. I thought, yeah, that's right. It shouldn't vary. So what I'm trying to say, and say poorly, is that you've got these foundation variables that should be demographic. They should be, look at the things that aren't going to vary month to month, really. They might vary between the census. And then what you do is you overlay the market information, the market data. But what that does, all that really then tells you is market conditions might cycle. It tells you what price to pay. It says, should I be buying ahead of the curve? Am I paying too much or paying too little? I should still buy there. It's just a matter of price and what I should pay to buy there. So to answer your question, some of the things we're looking at this for the evergreen list are primarily those things you get from the census. Look at jobs information as well. Is there a diversity of employment? Now, that used to be a great metric, but then they threw in all of the workers who are doing the NDIS, and they threw them in the same bucket as doctors. So, we used to look at, is any of these employment categories greater than 10%? And, if there's a concentration of jobs in one industry, still use it, but it's a bit diluted now because it's not as valuable because the government's done some funny things. Unemployment rate, okay, that's a given as well. And then you're looking at some other fundamentals like, is there a rental market? Is it a solid rental market? Not too big, not too small. You don't want something below 10%, probably a little bit too shallow. You don't want above 50% because those markets above 50% are the ones that start to get a little bit wobbly, especially with COVID and all the students went home, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a suite of variables that say, is this a good foundation area? And I include factors such as affordability. Now, yes, affordability can be variable because of the price, but you can kind of come up with a few things to say, are people paying well and truly over the 10-year mark? And that kind of isn't something that's going to dramatically vary week to week, month to month. So it's something you'd stretch out over several months.
And then you have there's a reference to hospital and CIFA scores, right?
Yes, if you got the choice, I like to look at a CIFA score of 6 and above. So that tells you, am I in the top 50% in comparison to other neighbourhoods or other because they do the CIFA score. It's a socioeconomic score that looks at a whole range of things. Income's part of it, that's the obvious one, but education, access to services, etc. And if you've got a choice between property A and property B, and one's in a CIFA area of 3 and one's in a CIFA area 6, which would you choose? You go for the one that has the highest socioeconomic foundations. So I like to look at CIFA and apply that. It is snobbery. It is absolute snobbery. So I apply the CIFA score, and then I say, are there those other factors such as, is it commutable? Is there a hospital there, etc.? So pardon me, there's some dogs. There's a bit of it's that bewitching hour when kids and family come home.
Very excited.
I know the feeling. So that's super helpful, right? So what we've covered there is single data points are not helpful. It's at the street level, not at the suburb level. But what happens when you interpret at the suburb level? There's some affordability there. So there's a whole bunch of wonderful things, and it kind of speaks to the bit why we've always loved chatting with you over the journey, Kent, because property is an art and a science, and you nail the science, right? Which then allows us to use that in interpreting how we then have the art part of it as well. So as we go and have a look now, and we do a sort of around the grounds, East Coast, Central Coast, and West Coast, what are you observing with those markets? And with the classic disclaimer here that we just went and said generalized commentary helps no one, and then we're just going to feed into a bit of generalized commentary. But What are some of the things that you might be observing that people could be taking away in the different regions around the country?
Yes, I'll start with Sydney. Sydney's had its downward run, and inventory levels have become so low. It's been more than 12 months in most markets, so it's starting to turn the corner. I think the broad statement here is, how many years of capital growth did we bring forward? Is it 4 or 5 years? So, I'm not predicting what the growth rates are. I'm just predicting that the worst is behind most of Sydney. So I'd probably say that the other call out at a broad level is the pursuit of affordability has really influenced almost every market. So that pursuit of under 500K or pursuit of under 600K, it's huge. It's not just investors chasing that. It's first home buyers, etc. So that's had a big impact across the country. Kind of working around the regions are a bit of a mixed bag. And again, I think a lot of North Queensland and whatnot, it's very hard to pick. Townsville can be hot, cold, and Cairns can be hot, cold, etc. I think the Gold Coast is still really strong. A lot of the influence on the Gold Coast specifically is the rental market is in absolute crisis. Brisbane looks fine. A lot of markets that were turning down have actually turned around. So it's starting to bubble up to a lot of my charts again. So, again, depending on where you are, but, the good old Capella bar test, it's kind of starting to bubble up and turn up again in it. So I think Brisbane looks good. Wollongong, Newcastle came in quite strong in my charts for the last couple of months. That's my hometown as well. And it was I was looking at all the things of price movement, inventory movement, etc. And I did a scorecard. Newcastle came in very strongly. I think it's kind of went from -1 to a 0 and maybe 0.5% now. So it's at that turning point. Melbourne is a real surprise. I love to kind of zoom in on the unit market in and around Melbourne City, Docklands, etc. It still is a high inventory area, but it's come down a little bit. But the rental market is going to drive so much of this now. So you had really high vacancy rates for years. Landlords doing it really tough for a long time. Your vacancy rates coming back down to normal, which, it's happened very rapidly. So watch that space, because I think that could drive a lot of the unit market in terms of that excess inventory being absorbed. So that's one to watch. I'm not saying invest there. I'm just saying, that it's an interesting scenario that the rental market, I think, is now driving Melbourne City as well. South Australia, it's had a golden run, and it still keeps on coming to the top of the charts in so many markets there. So especially the Adelaide Hills lagged a bit, obviously, but it came good a few months ago in a lot of the numbers. So, Adelaide's still solid, and Perth is still performing well. The only thing I worry about Perth is it just was so spoken about in these forums that there was just this rush of investors at scale in there, and I just worry that how much of it's driven by that herd mentality versus. But the bottom line is it's still affordable. So if you kind of step back from that risk of having a cluster of investors in one fell swoop go in there, when you look at the affordability metrics, Perth stands very, very strong. So I think that's its standout strength is, house prices relative to income. It really stands out very strongly.
I agree with you, Kent, in terms of we saw that rush in there. And then, in terms of our further due diligence on that location, it's got the third highest incomes in the country. So, everyone who's working in that space is relatively highly paid in that market, because when you can go and drive a truck for $120,000 to get someone to be a hairdresser or to get someone to be a property manager in that market, you've got to pay them 85. You can't pay them 65 like in other parts. So you do have that trickle down effect in terms of the wage stories in that location. Now, you combine that also with a couple of the other measures, which I always like looking at with your data is, time since peak, and then also what was the peak. Well, these markets are only getting back up to the levels of their peak back in 13, 14. So from that point of view, we're not even breaking new ground here yet. we're still basically paying catch up from the 25% that it gave back during that time. So I think those people who are getting into that market and then also seeing the sustainability of that market and the maturity of that market over time are going to be well rewarded. They've just obviously had that decade of loss if you were in that market because you just didn't time it correctly, or you got in at the peak of the mining boom before effectively APRA then started stepping in and stopping the borrowing power stories that we saw that really did curb that level of investment demand in that particular location. But a lot of what I'm seeing in Perth, and having a wife from there and knowing a few networks in that particular market, is a lot of the activity is also competing with the locals. It's not all just the investors coming in and steering that story.
Hey, Kent, my final question for you today is around your craft, right? So we only just got a snippet today of many conversations we've had and just tip of the iceberg of the expertise that you have. So how does having the craft that you have influence your decisions to participate in the market? Now, you gave us some stuff in the backstory around grandma said don't have debt, pay it off as quickly as you can, all that sort of stuff. So with that as a backdrop and with the insights that you have, which is the equivalent of insider trading, really, you've got an unfair advantage. How do you form a view around participating in the market personally as opposed to commentating on the market?
Analysis paralysis. That sums me up perfectly. With the investment properties, I really would get upset about the tenants and property managers. It just drove me nuts. So at the time it wasn't the right thing for me. But I'm actually sitting back now, waiting and looking at some fractional investment products. I'm quite interested in that. I've doubled down on super. I'm kind of at that brink. My wife is pushing me to re-enter again, but no, I'm not using any of my data for insider trading like that at this point in time. But my plan is to double down on it with some fractional investment products.
There we go. So some competitive advantage there in terms of definitely not insider trading. There's no such thing in real estate.
Well, I'm being loose with it, aren't I? I mean, insider trading is illegal, but it's within.
Yes,
so I'm
true.
being cute, but you do have an unfair advantage.
Now, Kent, obviously our community is better for your time on this pod, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future. One of the things that Bryce and I are super proud of in terms of our community is when we go out there and we identify thought leaders, businesses that are doing the right thing, looking after their customers and the like, we get them on, we give them a seat on the couch and we say, share your wisdom and knowledge with the team. And again, we only scratch the tip of the iceberg today with the insights that you've got. And again, we look forward to getting you on in the future. For those of you who are interested in the work that Kent's doing, can we recommend, Suburb Trends? We'll put some information in the show description so you can check that out and you can see some of the research work that he's also doing in that particular space. But, mate, as someone who I've obviously had a couple of years of getting to know you and looking at, the work that you do, thank you very much for all of the knowledge that I get from you in terms of looking at data in different ways, slicing and dicing it in the different perspectives. And that's only, ironing, sharpening iron. So from my point of view, thanks, mate, for sharing that and for coming on the pod. And we look forward to catching up with you real soon.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. It was a really good podcast. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise, I echo those sentiments, but we will have you on again. And folks, hopefully that was giving you some insights. I feel like there's some really key takeaways there for you. So there's an opportunity for you to circle back to see some of the thought processes that Kent applies to the property market so that perhaps you won't get paralysis by analysis, folks, if you're listening to that, and you can take some of his unfair advantage. But thanks again for coming on, Kent.
Thanks, Bryce.
There you go, Ben. Someone who is not only has a great pedigree, is a data nut, but just gets amongst it, and happened to mention to us before we push record that spent all day in the spreadsheets, Ben. So it was nice to have a chat with us. But that's his that's his craft. He's in the data, and to his credit, trying to interpret it and make it interesting.
Well, that's the discovery. You go into the data and you have discoveries and you learn about trends and methods and theories, and you put those theories through tests and you come up with good ways of measuring certain things. So you have fundamental measures, you have sort of organic measures, and in Kent's case, we're talking about sticking with some of those big fundamentals. So he's looking at the profile of the area very much on employment, incomes, all the classic fundamental stuff in terms of the people and the interest and the buyer demand inside that area. But then he also has the other fundamental stuff, which is, land size, variability, looking beyond just the median house price and then going into some of those other elements in terms of to come up with his conclusions about certain markets, and reaffirming the view that in the short term, markets can get ahead of themselves. And then obviously in the longer term, what drives the sustainability of those markets is ultimately the people that live in them, the activity that do, the human interest and human behaviour components of that, and putting all of that through a washing machine and coming out with those insights. And that's what we love about Kent and anyone who plays in this data space who is looking for those proven fundamentals and those new data discoveries that allow them to form opinions on certain marketplaces and why you would be looking at them in a more serious context, whether that to be to purchase a home or to purchase an investment property.
And we've got some human behaviour insights too. And I always, I'm always tip my hat to someone who's prepared to let us know what it was like when they were growing up. And Kent was very frank, transparent, had a lot of candour around that. But I think there's also a lesson. I think Kent would be okay with us reinforcing this point that despite all this knowledge, to his admission, there was paralysis analysis, right? And so it kind of reinforces the message that we're trying to encourage our community that financial peace awaits someone who takes action. And if you don't take action, you could have a full justification. That man is, I promise you, is at the forefront of understanding all of the information that means it should be a no-brainer. But he's a human too, right? And he's got stuff going on that says maybe I should not do it now, or I have paralysis by analysis. But I think the insights at the science level was amazing, but just the art as well, the art of what your own mind and your own biases and what you got to do to overcome, take action.
Yeah, it's a really classic point. I mean, I've publicly said on this podcast before that I've had moments where the data was telling me the story to go for, and I didn't move. I didn't take action very early on. For many early years, I was still, coming from my background, and my anchor lines and my mooring lines were around, money and households and stress around that. So I probably could have even had a better portfolio than I do today if I had taken action. And I think to Kent's point around what his grandmother's story around being debt-free, that has been a mooring line, for Kent in terms of, some of the decisions that he's made about staying out of the market. But now, to his credit, he's now sort of looking at, fractional property investing and a few other opportunities there. So that might be the way in which he can spread that risk and put a bit of his money out in the market to get a return on that.
Very good. Thank you, Kent. We're grateful. I reckon our community would love it. And take up my suggestion, folks. There was a couple of points where you just hit that sort of back 15 seconds, back 30 seconds, just to re-listen to some of that stuff, because when it lands, game-changing stuff. Hey, my life hack today, Ben, is the power of the Do Not Disturb function on your phone, right? I'm an iPhone user. I don't think anyone's surprised by that. But I don't reckon I really got the power of this, right? Because I use a Mac. I'm recording this on a Mac as well, a desktop Mac. And so whenever I go Do Not Disturb on my phone, it also puts my Mac on Do Not Disturb. Because as we record, Ben, our producer's always saying, can you make sure that you've shut down all your, because otherwise, ding, we hear all this stuff in the background, right? So I just want to remind folks that there is if you pull down from the top right-hand corner of your iPhone, there's an opportunity to create a focus. You click on the focus and you can choose do not disturb, work, personal, driving, and all those sorts of things. But here's the beauty of that. The focus category, the work one is designed to help you stay focused while you're working. The personal one is designed to help you stay focused while you're playing. And you can go in and you can tweak these settings to go, well, when I'm in play mode, make sure no work stuff pops up. Or when I'm in work mode, make sure no play stuff pops up. Or when I'm asleep, make sure these things shut down. Or you can do a custom. So you can customize it, Ben. For some people, they go, "Oh, do it, Ross. That's been around for a while." Maybe I'm slow to the party, Ben, but I've been using the power of that focus function to its full effect of late. And I thought I'd share, mate. Are you using it?
No, well, my lovely wife uses it when she's driving. So I'm like, I know she might be driving, so I'm not going to call her. I'll put the text there, but I also I'm currently driving. So she'll get to it later on. So yeah, it's definitely being used in our household. I'm not that sophisticated on the do not disturb, but I don't pick up my phone anyway, mate. You know that.
No, you don't. You don't.
I
There's
don't
no
have
risk
that
there.
sort of distraction problem.
You do not have the distraction problem. I'm reading a book at the moment called Stolen Focus by Johan Hari.
Yep.
I'm going to talk maybe to it next week for
Cool.
my life hack, but it is game changing. It helps people like me that are addicted to distraction. I don't know what happened to you. How come you don't? Anyway, we won't go down that rabbit, Warren, but you do not get distracted easily. Hey, mate, what's making property news?
Well, I thought we'd talk about the property outlook update that we did from February, Bryce, and we put our thesis out there in terms of where we thought the cash rate could eventually end. Now, remembering it's just a pause, and we mentioned at the start of the show we want to talk about that it's pause, it's not on hold. And, sort of the RBA stressed that point that they reserve the right to continue to keep putting the cash rate up. But it is going to be a fascinating time now in terms of, are we going to see more supply come in? Are we going to see more buyers come in? We've automatically seen in some of our data that we track only in the last couple of days that there's definitely been more curiosity. People who were thinking that they'd pick the bottom, they may have missed that opportunity now that we were talking about.
We've been on record saying that you're probably better off getting in before that moment, Ben. Yes.
Yeah. So I want to also say I want to put a caveat on that, right? Because if interest rates do go up further, or if interest rates stay higher for longer, we're probably going to be bouncing along the bottom more than, I did hear someone in the media talk about a potential V-shaped recovery in the property market. I'm definitely not seeing that as something that would generally happen. But I am definitely seeing certain pockets of the market where there's going to be some strong momentum. And so, if a lot of supply arrives, and we'll keep our community updated from month to month in terms of what we are seeing on that demand and supply, equation to sort of reassure people in terms of what is happening. But yeah, I'd be pretty comfortable if I bought a property in the last month or two, Bryce, when everyone else was fearful. I'd be thinking, well, even if it goes down by 1 or 2 more percent from here, I'm getting at 100% of the upside. Whereas in some markets, you're simply not going to get that if you haven't acted already. For those people who are looking, remember there are markets in markets, and that doesn't mean that the new markets to Kent's point are at the certain part of the cycle, the early part of the cycle, where they may enjoy more of that upside. But it's still quite interesting. I'm not a definitive person. I've just got a probability that I do see values being where they are or slightly higher at around a 60-40 ratio of probability between now and the end of Christmas. But I still see interest rates staying stubbornly higher if the inflation is still a problem. And to that point, Bryce, if I can just lean in and tell everyone in the community, like I do on my economic updates, can everyone just spend about 10% less than what you've been spending recent times? Because that will almost guarantee, if not 100% guarantee, rates will no longer go up any further, and the next likely move is a rate decrease rather than a rate increase.
And it'll be interesting to see now, interesting approach they take to see the data when you get a first tranche of people coming off fixed rates and see how that flows into households. And so, but yeah, back in January, Ben, February, when we did our outlook, we talked about it peaking at 3.6. It's currently sitting at 3.6, but we're not high-fiving yet because there is definitely potential for interest rates to go up again in May or June, depending on that data.
You know what they say about economic forecasting at the macro level, Bryce? You're either wrong or just lucky.
Yeah,
and that's the truth.
We're currently sitting in the latter.
Yeah, we are.
Very good. All right, so that's what's making property news. So big show, mate. We've covered a bit. We had a very special guest on today, so thank you again, Kent, for that. And mate, we've got another instalment of our Mythbuster series next week. We are covering on the buyer side, so looking forward to doing that with you next week, mate. But until we get there,
knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it.
There you go. See you next week, folks.